Samwise presents Only Fools and Podcasts, an in-depth episode-by-episode guide, analysis and celebration of England's most beloved and successful sitcom. To find out more about the show, contact us at onlyfoolspod@gmail.com. Lovely jubbly. Au revoir and hello and welcome to Only Fools and Podcasts, a show dedicated, as you may have already guessed, solely to the adulation of the world's greatest sitcom. Phew! Episode 3, and here we are again. I must say, sorry for the slight delay. I've just got a new job and moved to a new house, so que sera sera, but here we are, ready to dive into another semi-classic episode. Cash and Curry isn't exactly one of those episodes that I, kind of seek out or specifically make time for, but it certainly is one that I definitely remember and does stick out in my mind, mostly just for its unique stamp in the Only Fools canon. And while Sullivan did give us a very diverse London, there really aren't that many episodes like this that delve into one specific culture and its own inner workings quite in the same way that this one does. And that might be for the best, actually. When we're introduced to Denzel later on in the show's run, he's not really introduced as a, quote-unquote black character. He's introduced just to us as a character, one of Dell's friends. And I think that actually achieves more for what Sullivan was aiming for than creating, I wouldn't say cardboard cutout stereotypes, as it does work in the episode's favour in this instance. But the other in this episode really isn't fleshed out all that well. So, as you all know, before I dive into each episode, I like to just do a little bit of a preamble, a digression, a diversion, if you will, just to give you some of the backstory and context of the show. Last week I started to cover a bit about who Dell Boy was and his inception as a character, but for this episode, I thought we could touch on the man behind the character, the iconic face of Dell Boy. I am, of course, talking about David Jason. Right, if you have any basic knowledge of British TV pop culture, you know this man's face. Be it from the stern, mustachioed Detective Inspector Frost, or as Arkwright in Ronnie Barker's seminal Open All Hours, which still surprisingly holds up. Though don't even get me started on its cash cow safe bet sequel series, still Open All Hours. That's a discussion for another time. David Jason is what's known as television royalty, and has played so many iconic roles that he can essentially do no wrong. Or at least when he does, he's almost instantly forgiven. But what made him so instantly lovable and iconic? Was it the writing? Well, yeah, to some degree, I suppose. Jason has always had a knack for being able to position himself in shows that have always had a strong writing staff at the helm and always give him the most interesting material to work with, meaning he's always pushing himself to never stagnate or put on a boring performance. And no two of his characters are ever alike. He could have easily played London Cockney geezers after being Dell Boy, but he never did. But what truly made him what he is his sheer juggernaut ability to connect with the audience. He has a cheeky grin, a wry smile, and one of the most friendly faces an actor like him could have. Now, I'm genuinely not being mean or anything when I say this here, but he's not what you'd call a conventionally very handsome actor, even though he does have a very large female following. He has what I like to call, especially in foreign films, a real face, a human face, a face of the people. He isn't Tom Hiddleston or Benedict Cumberbatch, which means he has the added benefit of being a more relatable canvas for us to project our own thoughts and emotions onto. In looking more like a quote-unquote real person also means that all the wacky and zany events that happen to him can feel all the more real and tangible, and in reverse also make all of those more tragic elements of the show hit home all the harder. When speaking about Dell, Jason said, "I came from the same sort of roots as Dell. We both came from poor working class families and we went to the same sort of school. But that's where we went our separate ways. For example, he's far more confident than I ever was. He's got more front than Blackpool, and I'm just not like that. You can't help liking him. He's a little man trying to succeed against all the odds. He thinks that one day he will do the deal that will make him a millionaire. His education is off the streets, and he does get spaced out sometimes by people who are well read." One of the great things I found out about David Jason whilst doing the research for this podcast was that he's actually been known to help bring people out of comas. This is something that a lot of characters and voice actors with very memorable voices have been known to do. Mel Blanc, most famously, the voice behind Bugs Bunny, as well as innumerable other cartoon characters, also brought people out of comas. He'd go over to them, possibly over the phone, just go, "Yeah, what's up, Jack?" And it's something about the familiar, something you love, can just snap you out of that trance-like state. Jason was quoted as saying, "Their families wrote to me, asking me to do the Dell Boy on tape and asking me to talk to them in character because it was their favourite show and they thought it might help. And it did, because those people have written back to me. To me, this has been the very best side of playing Dell Boy. I feel very fortunate that I was able to help. It's an unbelievable power and shows what a powerful medicine comedy is. And I couldn't put it better than that, really. I know that in my experience, what Jason has brought to the role of Dell has not only given me an infinite amount of joy, but the whole country and possibly the whole world as well. He is Only Fools and Horses. As much as Nicholas Lyndhurst, Leonard Pierce, and Buster Merrifield brought to the show, the iconic face of Only Fools and Horses is Dell Boy. Born David John White on February 2nd, 1940, his father was a fish porter and his mother was a charlady, much like John Sullivan himself. He, his parents and two siblings all lived in a terraced house in Finchley, North London. Very much like Sullivan, his parents were keen for him to get a trade, but before he left school, he had his first acting gig in a play called Wayside War, which I'm not familiar with at all. A reluctant actor, Jason only did it because one of his classmates dropped out with the measles. He was later then asked to join a local Am-Dram society, and initially he said no to the offer, but since his friend informed him that there were 25 girls and no boys in the group, he said, "When do I start?" And from then, you could argue his fate was sealed. He fell in love with acting. By his mid-20s, he'd fulfilled his parents' desires to actually start a trade and became an electrician with his friend Bob Bevel, and they started a partnership called B&W Installations. However, he still did want to act, and in 1965 his brother was offered a job in the BBC police drama series Z Cars, which would earn him a tidy £25, plus £9 a week further. He recommended Jason to the director, who then saw a bit of Jason's acting on the side and pretty much hired him on the spot. After this, he began to do a lot of on and off acting work, mostly doing a year-long residency contract with the Bromley Rep. This is where his talent for physical and comedic acting really came into play, as he would always be cast in parts that required him to fall down or be knocked over, which is something he would become very famous for during the iconic Dell Boy falling through the bar moment. As he described it, I had to do any part that came up in any play every 2 weeks. I was always playing something, from a vicar to a Derek Doyle lookalike, falling over or jumping through hoops. It was around this time that a very alternate universe must have sprung into existence, as Jason almost landed a role in another seminal sitcom, Dad's Army, to the point where his agent actually rang him up to tell him he'd got the gig, only to cancel and retract that statement around 3 hours later. It must have been gutting, really. Could you imagine if David Jason had been cast as Lance Corporal Jones instead? He wouldn't have been able to play Granville in Open All Hours. He would never have met Ray Butt, and then ultimately never have been cast as Dell. He says, "After I lost the part in Dad's Army, it started to become really successful, and there were times where I'd watch it and see Corporal Jones, and I'd say, I was offered that bloody part." In regards to all the possibilities, he went on to say, "You can't help thinking like that, though. At the time, I thought it would have changed my life because I would have been recognised as a television actor, which I wasn't at that stage. But that's all history now. But not getting that part actually had a major effect on my career. But when I think about it, the whole road that led me to getting the part of Dell is littered with ifs and buts." After this slight setback, in 1967 he got his first TV gig on the children's comedy series Do Not Adjust Your Set, alongside much of the original Monty Python crew. In this show, one of Dell's roles was that of Dithers, the 100-year-old gardener, which, as Jason described, is a role that required an actor capable of being knocked over and could fall down, as you can't get old men to fall down for real, because if you do, they'll probably break something. The show was an instant success, and the role of Dithers, to which Jason took like a fish to water, caught the eye of Ronnie Barker, who cast Jason in the very first episode of Open All Hours, which was back then just designed to be a one-off as a part of a few shows that Ronnie Barker was putting out at the time. This turned out to be directed by Ray Butt, the producer of Only Fools, and we all know how that turned out. Just after this, he was also cast as the rather brilliant role of Blanco in 3 episodes of Ronnie Barker's other show, Porridge, where again he very naturally adopts the role of a much older character. I mean, when I first saw this show and the episodes that Jason was in, I actually didn't know it was him. Looking back, the makeup's not that obvious and not that heavy, but until it was pointed out to me, I genuinely just thought he was an older actor, and the way he inhabits the older man is just effortless and looks so natural. Jason's ability to play older actors would also come into play in terms of the casting of Only Fools and Horses, as his ability to play a slightly older man was perfectly reflected against the boyish looks of Rodney, which somewhat sealed the continuity of their age gap. Then, in 1979, he was reluctantly cast as the character that would shoot him into superstardom that we all know and love today. and that, of course, would be Dell Boy. On the subject of his newfound fame, Jason said, "I tend to not go anywhere. I don't have to. I don't go shopping or into pubs or the cinema very much, mainly because I know what's going to happen. It's part of the job and a downside, but it's a small price to pay for the fun that we've had making the show and the enjoyment that it's brought to people." Now, that's just a brief summary of what David Jason was doing up until the time he played Dell. I'm sure at some point I'm going to get back to what he did after Only Fools and Horses, as his resume only seemed to expand into more and more interesting roles, though he would always come back to Dell. But let's crack on with the episode. This is Cash and Curry. Like I've said, this episode is another fantastic example of flourishing the multicultural ideals that Sullivan wanted to convey in a modern London setting show like Only Fools and Horses. According to the Only Fools lore, this episode only came about purely because of the pun in the title, which admittedly is very good, and the script was actually just worked around it later. Can you tell this? Well, again, unless you pointed that fact out to me, I'd just assume that this is one of those middling season 1 episodes. I want to now start avoiding phrases like "it's not particularly good" or "particularly bad," as I know I've already said it before. But it has to be said that nothing in season 1 really stands out. I don't think anyone's favourite episode is in season 1. You know, Big Brother, the first episode, is a nice historical artefact in terms of seeing the show's progression. But the solid characterization and the relentless laugh after laugh writing just really wasn't there at this point. Funnily enough, this is the only episode during Leonard Pierce's life whereby Grandad makes no appearance whatsoever. This gives a bit of more of a roguish, two lads out and about using their wits kind of feel, and it opens up the show in terms of the scope of where the characters can go and what they can do. Certain characters can come and go where need be if the narrative fits. You know, they're not just going to shove Grandad in just because he's a fan favourite. And I think the episode does work rather well without him. And, you know, again, we're slowly starting to see hints that this isn't your average everyday sitcom that's going to play by all of those rules. This is also the first of only 3 episodes where the Trotters' flat in Nelson Mandela House is not seen either. As with the aforementioned lack of Grandad, this also expands the show in scope of location of the series, meaning we're not always going to be tied down to the flat or the Nag's Head. Literally anything can happen. That's a good thing. Also, this is monumentally the first utterance of the classic phrase, plonker. Now, let's carry on. We open on Rodney, and what I think is the first time we ever see the classic 3-wheeled van parked up outside some sort of esteemed manor. Rodney makes his way over the drive and through the doors, and a very funky, mysterious Bond-esque theme begins to play as Rodney enters. Then we cut to see Dell rather tipsily sashaying down some marble stairs with a cigar and whiskey in hand, and he's very pleased to see that Rodney has come to pick him up. However, Rodney is rather miffed that Dell has gotten so bladdered that he's been forced to come and pick him up, especially since he actually had a girl back at the flat, which is also one of the first times we see Rodney actually having a bit of success with the ladies. But in typical Del Boy fashion, of course he's not going to let Rodney wallow in that success for any time at all. At least the show has some good morals about drink driving. However, Del does admit that he could have just gotten a cab, but he thought it would have been more impressive, in front of all of his new high society friends, to have Rodney come and act as his driver. Has this plan been hatched half by sly Del or half by drunk Del? Who knows? This is also the only reference in this series that we ever get to Dell's own personal car. Yes, it is hard to imagine that the Trotters actually had another vehicle before the Capri Gear, you know, the other staple Trotter vehicle. And, you know, most don't even remember that. Most people just assume that it's just the 3-wheel van. But no, in this episode, episode 3, we actually do see Dell's Vauxhall Velox, which I presume was just kept in the same garage where they kept Boyce's car. And yes, this one's also a bit of a pig as well. This also isn't the first time we see Dell Boy drunk, and I must admit I've never really been a fan of it. This is exacerbated wholly within the episode A Royal Flush, where he's kind of just embarrassing. Though I can't tell whether the discomfort I feel whenever I see Dell drunk isn't entirely intentional. Perhaps Sullivan, Jason, or both were keen to show the sad underbelly of the drunk. One of the show's strengths is that there are no lovable drunks or addicts in that sense. Seeing Dell drunk is like seeing your father drunk. Like, you know there's probably no harm in it in this instance, but it does make you feel uneasy. A man calls over to Dell, and Dell explains to Ronnie that this is his new contact, Vimal Malik. No relation to the director Terrence, of course. Now, not only is this great that we see Dell consorting with different types of people here, as it is always amusing when Dell assumes he can rub shoulders with high society and that they wouldn't notice, but also that the member of this high society that he's talking to is an Indian man. Now, not giving away the end of the episode that does somewhat turn this on its head, it is nice to see that even back in 1980, that he's not just some corner shop owner. Okay, yes, the other Indian man we meet does own several curry houses, but at least he's enterprising, well spoken and well dressed. There are no funny accents, and they also avoid any silly visual stereotypes. So we cut to outside, and we have one of my favourite little TV tropes, and that is the audience coming into the scene during the punchline of a joke that we will never see nor hear. And it's always fun to work out whatever ludicrous setup has been made from the joke. Dell is walking with his new acquaintance Vimmel as Rodney trails behind as they leave the event in high spirits, and Dell is full of said spirits. They are suddenly stopped by two men, one a smaller business type and the other a large bruiser in a turban. As soon as they get out their car, it's clear that there is an instant history between Vimmel and these two. Seeing this disturbance, however, Dell swaggers forward with a concerned look in his eye. He is ready to defend Vimmel at any cost, whether this is down to his own trademark loyalty to his friends that we've always admired him for, or if it's just a shrewd business opportunity and another chance to impress a potential business partner is anyone's guess. Again, it's probably somewhere between the two. The two men say they have no quarrel with Dell and they only wish to speak to Vimmel. Dell then threatens them with a smack in the ear. The mysterious man then warns Dell that his bruiser is a karate expert, to which Dell replies, "Well, I'm a black belt in origami," a phrase which I must rather ashamedly say I've used myself in countless times. With Dell not backing down, the large man in the turban then descends upon him, giving him a very loud and bombastic display of his martial prowess and technique. Dell remains unfazed, and once he gets close enough, Dell quickly shouts, "Police!" and everyone swiftly turns round, including the camera. As soon as this happens, we hear a large, off-camera thud. Cutting back to Dell, we see the large man gripping his sore testicles as he falls to his knees, with Dell stood triumphant, puffing away at his cigar. This scene comes straight out of Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, in my opinion, where similarly, Indy is confronted by a large man in a turban, wielding a large sword and doing some equally flashy tricks. And as we all know, Indy, with little effort, just goes for the simple method and shoots the guy. Dell Boy does this also. He goes for the simple method. He doesn't want to get into a fight. He's in his best clothes. This is just the non-lethal Peckham Dell Boy version of the same scene. I think it's also important to make the distinction that whilst we do see the results of Dell Boy hitting this man in the ghoulies, we actually don't see the act of violence itself. Now, you could put this down to the BBC not wanting to have violence in their primetime programming, but I personally see this as a moment being indicative as to how we perceive Dell Boy as a character throughout the show's entire run. Now, we know he's no pushover, but if we were to actually see Dell actually commit an act of violence, we may lose some of our love of the character. Yes, he may grab Rodney by the scruff of his neck a few times, but we never see him hit him. And again, whether he does it in self-defense or to defend someone else or not, if we actually saw Dell slug someone, I don't know, I think the respect could possibly be lost there. But that's just me. The fact that in this fight he uses somewhat dirty tricks and his cheeky wits to overcome a much greater foe does, to be fair, perfectly fit in line with Dell's character. It's always hard to do comedic violence, as the consequences of violence are always too real. For example, the Season 6 episode Little Problems highlights this perfectly, where we see Dell forlorn with all his cuts and bruises after an encounter with the Driscoll brothers. This scene isn't played for laughs at all. Dell then quickly signals Rodney and Vimmel to get in the car, only to swiftly realise, after making a victorious quip over his defeated foe, that Rodney and Vimmel have stupidly driven off without him, leaving him with his assailants. The businessman then claims it's not good to leave on such terms, and does in fact invite Dell to come and eat with him. Dell, realising he has little choice in the matter, acquiesces to this. We then open on a lovely curry meal. God, I could go for some Saag curry right now. And as we see, Dell is sat comfortably with his two past assailants. We are immediately introduced to the possibly dual-face element of the character here. It's very subtle, and until you know what you're looking for, it might just get passed off as another joke. And it's done through yet another first in the show's run, subtitles. Speaking in his native tongue, the man tells the waiter, "If this idiot orders any more, tell him the kitchen is closed." Obviously Dell does not understand this and just smiles and carries on eating. He actually says this most likely due to the fact that we know Dell can and does eat more curry than any fictional character known to man. It is the lasagna to his Garfield. In the background, we see a rather lanky figure skittishly running around and bursting in. He is searching for something. Of course, we see it's Rodney. who is clearly very worried about his older brother and is ready for a fight. Dell tells Rodney to calm down and snarkily reminds him that it's still taken him an hour and a half to come and find him in the first place. To which Rodney replies that Dell, in his own absent-mindedness, had actually forgotten to mention which curry house he was actually in, meaning Rodney has visited so many Indian establishments in the London area that he can now say "get stuffed" in Urdu. Dell then introduces Rodney/us, the audience, to the mysterious businessman as Mr. Ram and his bruiser as Oddjob. Mr. Ram describes himself as an immigrant success story, whereby he now owns 18 similar restaurants across the country and now has enough land that it would take him 9 till 2 to drive around it. Now, this level of wealth, obviously, as we know, catches Dell's ears as he listens in intently. Mr. Ram then describes that he and Vimal's family have been engaged in somewhat of a feud spanning over 100 years, due to the fact that Vimal, being from the higher caste, and as a reward for helping the British secure rule in India, threw out Ram's ancestors off their land and stole a priceless family heirloom. The heirloom itself is a statue of the Hindu god Kuera. Ram then bemoans that he is now a rich man and regrets having to stoop to the intimidation tactics that we'd seen earlier. Then he casually mentions that he would be willing to pay at least £4,000 for said statue, for which Dell stops in his tracks, shattering his poppadom in his mouth. After Dell inquires as to why he simply hasn't done this, Vimal explains that he simply cannot make the trade because of the Indian caste system, which bars him and Vimal for actually sitting down and making such a trade. Dell advises that Ram needs a mutual friend to act as a go-between. Rodney then becomes immediately suspicious, and in no time at all, Ram asks Dell and Rodney to be just that, the go-between. After Dell mentions that they will see him tomorrow, Ram parts with some last words. He says he does not trust Vimal Malik or his family, and therefore will not part with any of his money until the statue is safe in his hands. Dell is confident, however, claiming he and Vimal are super close, despite the fact that we only see them for one night together, but again, this is Dell we're talking about here. The scene then ends with Dell, accidentally this time, elbowing Oddjob in the testicles again. We cut to Vimal's house now, and we see him sat with Rodney and Dell over a cup of tea. From the offset, he's very concerned that Dell would even share a meal with Ram, calling him a gutter dog. Dell explains that he's both of their friends, and that Ram has explained the little misunderstanding between the two families over a century ago, and the nature of the statue. After some considerable floundering on Dell's part, being unable to phrase the transaction, Rodney cuts in and says, "He wants to buy it off you." Vimal explains that due to family pride he wouldn't even sell the statue for £1,000,000, but, out of curiosity, asks what Ram's figure actually was. Now, we see Rodney was once again here about to cut in and answer the correct answer of £4,000, but Dell interjects, stating that Mr. Ram's offer was only for £2,000. Vimal then replies that the most he was ever offered for it was around £150. Dell then uses his private eye detective skills and begins his inquiry. He infers that, based on the state of the house that Vimal's been living in, that maybe he's been over-exaggerating his wealth at the event the night before. Vimal then points out the caste system the same as Ram, and that giving up the statue would also be like him giving up a birthright. Dell then tells a story about how he and Rodney both fell on hard times and they had to raffle their own family heirloom, before Rodney swiftly points out that they'd learned nothing, as somehow Dell also luckily had the same winning ticket. Dell probably tries to take it one step too far here, pushing his luck by implying that the statue is in fact cursed, blaming it for Vimal's rather meagre existence at the moment. Vimal concludes that whilst he isn't a superstitious man, he is a businessman and a realist, and accepts the offer. Then Vimal gets up and goes to fetch the statue, leaving the two in the room. Rodney, who up until this point had been relatively self-contained, explodes as soon as Vimal is out of earshot, angrily questioning Dell as to what the hell he's doing, offering Vimal £2,000 less than the agreed price. Dell claims it was a mere slip of the tongue, so Rodney offers to correct this, but Dell begs him not to, lest Vimal thinks he's trying to con him, again, which Rodney rightly points out that is exactly what he is doing. Dell, in typical Dell form, begins trying to bend Rodney to his will, imparting his own sense of ideology. He says, "No man is an island," and that he talks about a French phrase that roughly translates, as Rodney figures out to, meaning fish stew, my friend. Dell replies, "Need I say more?" Rodney panics, and Dell points out that because of the wonderful caste system, Vimal and Ram can never meet to corroborate the story between each other. Rodney claims it's immoral. Dell that it's free enterprise. Rodney then says, it's illegal. Dell says, but we can earn £1,000 each. Rodney then says, it's fraud. And Dell, rather brilliantly, just pauses and says, are you in? Rodney also pauses. Yeah, all right. I love the way Dell can just instantly crush any of Rodney's sort of moralistic standings, because not only does it allow us to get on with the episode itself, but also shows that Rodney himself isn't exactly perfect either. Vimmel then brings in the statue, and Dell admires the Ming Dynasty craftsmanship. He then offers to bring the money back post-haste, but Vimmel, being the yin to Ram's yang, similarly does not trust the other, and won't depart with the statue until the money has come instead. Despite Dell offering to leave Rodney as a cheap deposit, they both leave after Vimmel convinces Dell to use his influence over Ram to get the money first. In the hallway of Vimmel's building, the two discuss about what they're going to do next. Dell swiftly realises that Vimmel will have no way of actually telling whether any money is from Ram or not. So after Rodney quickly puts the kibosh on going to a bank or robbing a bank, Dell suggests that they should do the one thing they actually know how to do: trade. We then cut to what's basically the second montage sequence of the series, rather similar to the one in the first episode. We see a series of moments where Dell is selling anything and everything he previously just described to Rodney in the hall, including TVs, leather jackets, all of his jewellery, and we just see the cash notes start to roll in. In the original broadcasting of this montage sequence, the accompanying music was actually Pink Floyd's Money, but due to weird contracting issues with the BBC now distributing said episode, they didn't really know that home video was really going to be a thing. We now have some generic little hustler music instead. There's actually a great little moment in the sequence whereby they're taking clothes to a second-hand clothes shop, and Dell actually grabs some of the clothes that were on the table outside of said shop and sells them back to its owner. It's a great little sequence to me, just to see Dell doing well at trading every now and then. It does give us that little uplift of hope to say that, say if somehow miraculously they lost all of their money by the end of an episode due to unforeseen events like a con, that they would eventually bounce back on their feet, as well as explaining how they always do seem to be in stock, despite how whenever we see them, they seem rather inept traders. I think this is the second and last of these montage sequences. I can't think of any other one, almost entirely down to a stylistic choice on behalf of the director, who did all of season 1. Back at Vimmel's house, the money falls right onto the table next to the statue. Dell seems to be in a hurry and goes to check his watch, claiming it's at the mender's. Just outside, Rodney is sat bored in the van and looks over to see the victorious triumphant Dell holding the statue aloft over his head. Upon declaring his victory, Dell falters at the last moment and stumbles, tumbling down the stairs and sending the presumably fragile statue flying into the air. Going back to my little digression at the start of this episode, this is a fantastic and oft unremembered example of David Jason's brilliant comic physicality. Is he falling realistically? Not really. But is he conveying the dynamic, comedic sense of panic and exaggerated movement? Yes, entirely. He acts it well, and the look of terror on his face is as heartbreaking as it is hilarious. And judging from the crowd reaction here, as this was shown in front of a live studio audience, this moment was a real crowd pleaser. Though, it does make you think, based on what we will soon find out, that if Dell had actually dropped the statue here, it may have revealed more about what it's actually made of and where it comes from than it initially meets Dell's non-inquisitive eye. Back at the same curry house as before, Rodney and Dell arrive and make their way over to the waiter from before, asking to see Mr. Ram, who they call the owner. However, the person they assumed was the waiter actually claims to be the owner himself, so the two plonkers presume this is just down to his English being a bit broken and flawed. They proceed to do the typical British foreigner thing of only attempting to bridge the language barrier by simply talking slower and louder. Lager, mate, can I have a lager? It's interesting to see how in this scene that it does touch on a slight racial note. You know, again, like with the gay scene in the last episode, it's not done with any malice. It just sort of casually points out that upon a misunderstanding between two cultures like this, we can just tend to assume it's down to something like a language barrier, i.e. a fault of the other person for not knowing English, rather than tombing a couple of dipsticks and not understanding the situation at all. After failing to get across anything to the owner, Dell asks if he's remembered at all, and the proprietor simply states, "You all look alike to me." It's a great little twist and reversal on a similar racial issue. Again, not done with hate, it's just a joke, people. The owner then realises that he does remember the meal with Ram that Dell is referring to, claiming that Ram took off and gave him a dodgy check. The owner then proceeded to go to the address listed on the bounce check and find that Ram was gone, and he then suggests to Dell that perhaps Ram may have been fibbing. Then he points out to Dell and Rodney that he can't imagine why they would pay Ram £2,000 for this statue, as you could get them on Portobello Road for £17 each. The camera then pans hilariously to reveal two identical statues already in the restaurant, which presumably were also there the night Dell ate there. He says, "It's amazing what you can save when you shop around." Dell and Rodney both have a look of horror on their face, and Dell says he can feel a very strong nosebleed coming on. And I'd be worrying too, as they have sold almost everything in the flat. They literally almost have nothing left. On the motorway, we see Ram and Vimal sat together in the back of a car. They are both finely dressed, drinking and celebrating, though in the original script it should have also had them smoking cigars, but it's a minor quibble. They are both laughing at all the stupid things that Dell had told each of them respectively. The two declare that they are basically con men, and they've done the same thing before to other people, and that they will now go and do the same thing in Birmingham, Manchester and Newcastle. Basically anywhere where people will exploit the religious bigotry of two stupid immigrants. These two characters really, in essence, turn the whole episode on its head, and they make us do that thing where we have to re-review all of Dell's actions throughout the course of the whole episode. Was he in fact exploiting two ignorant immigrants? Well, perhaps, but you could also easily argue that since Dell has no one he discriminates against negatively, then that by virtue also means that he won't positively discriminate against anyone either. Anyone is up for the conning for him, but if he has to use any specific cultural linchpins to seal the deal, then so be it. We also have to ask ourselves as an audience whether we were also guilty of what they are discussing. Did we buy into the strange alien world of the other and just believe them just because they're part of some other culture that we either don't care for or don't understand, or have maybe even never made an attempt to understand? Perhaps it's just out of British politeness, we don't want to offend other people, so we go along with whatever they say. I was also very glad to hear Birmingham, my hometown, being mentioned in this scene also. It's the only recognition Birmingham ever got in the show, and, after this point all we really got was a very terrible daytime drama simply titled Doctors, but more recently we've gotten the brilliant show Peaky Blinders. Back outside Vimal's house, Dell leaves the same door where he once held the statue victoriously. Now he's sullen and in defeat. He looks shaken and faint. It turns out Vimal also packed his bags 5 minutes straight after they left. Dell mournfully walks over to Rodney and says, "As Macbeth said to Hamlet in Midsummer's Night Dream, we've been done up like a couple of kippers." And they really have. Rodney suggests about going to the police, but Dell scoffs at the idea, not about, them admitting that they were trying to con someone, but purely because they wouldn't be able to hold up their heads in court again for being known as two apparently savvy guys who were conned like a couple of idiots. Now, whilst being slightly tragic, the idea of not being able to hold up your head in court again is actually a lot funnier than the laugh track audience actually give it for. Then he ironically professes just how con men like Vimal and Ram can actually sleep at night, despite the fact he was just doing the same thing. They then mourn the loss of all of their worldly possessions, realising they are literally left with nothing. Dell then says he is emotionally peckish and suggests getting something to eat. Rodney jokingly suggests the local curry house down the road, but instantly sees Dell's anger and claims it was just a joke. Dell then hurls the now valueless statue at Rodney in freeze frame, and we cut to credits. So, in conclusion, it's a very watchable episode. Again, like I've said before, it's very unique. It is essentially just the classic con man plot, really. The best example I can think of being the Michael Caine, Steve Martin film Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, whereby in the end, the con men always end up falling victim to another secret con artist that they didn't expect before. This means audiences are never left with a bad taste in their mouth, as our heroes never actually get to fulfill any of their illegal or immoral acts, nor profit from them. You can attempt bad acts on the BBC, as long as you don't profit from it. A quick flaw that I noticed in Vimal and Ram's plan that could have sent up the whole thing in the air if Rodney and Dell weren't both blind plonkers really, is that despite the fact that the main linchpin of the episode, the main claim, is that they cannot possibly meet nor converse to discuss the statue, they do in fact meet and converse in the initial standoff at the start of the episode, or at least it's implied that it would have happened if Dell and Rodney hadn't have been there. But to be fair, the whole episode requires a whole lot of suspensions of disbelief. Now, I know that whilst Only Fools does subvert several tropes of the sitcom,
it still tends to suffer from a good old case of the status quos. You know, I would have potentially been very interested in a direct follow-up episode to this, whereby the Trotters literally have nothing and try and work their way back up to the top, or at least break even. You know, I kind of think this episode is better in its goals and what it's trying to achieve, rather than its execution. I feel Dell and Rodney aren't quite fully fleshed out yet, and are conned a little too easily here. Dell's not really that stupid. He can be tricked, but I feel like he's more outwitted by women than anything. But in its attempt to broaden the racial and cultural scope of its cast of London, it's very admirable, and to its credit, it does create a very unique look and feel to the episode. Like I've said, there isn't one quite like it. Plus the whole episode, as we hadn't seen Dell eat a curry prior to it, could all be some elaborate prequel to Dell's dicky belly in the episode Sickness and Wealth. So that was Cash and Curry. A very unique, if somewhat little light on the laughs department episode, but a very worthy entry in the series, especially for Season 1. I'm Sam Wiles, and you've been listening to Only Fools and Podcasts. I hope you enjoyed the show, and I'm sure I'll see you next time. When we meet again, we'll be going over Dell's first misadventure with antique furniture and the opposite sex in the second time around. Till then, folks. Oh, and don't forget, this time next year, we'll have 1 million downloads.